This is where people usually go wrong. They step onto the brilliantly lit stages of the world, into the hushed, imposing boardrooms of global corporations, or across the intimate, fragile spaces of a dining room table. Armed with a meticulously crafted arsenal of unyielding logic, pristine facts, and irrefutable data, they unleash a magnificent torrent of profound thoughts, perfectly articulated according to the rigid, ancient rules of grammar, syntax, and intellectual rigor. They speak with the fiery conviction of those who believe that truth is a physical object that can simply be handed from one mind to another. And when they are inevitably met with blank, glassy stares, fierce, irrational opposition, or a chilling, deafening indifference, they instinctively blame the audience. They retreat into a comforting, arrogant delusion, convinced that the listeners are simply too ignorant, too deeply entrenched in their stubborn biases, or too easily distracted to possibly grasp the blinding brilliance of their offering. But in the invisible, highly volatile, and deeply emotional ether of human communication, a devastating, universally ignored truth reigns supreme. The utterance itself is entirely, fundamentally meaningless. The only reality that exists, the only truth that governs the chaotic actions of sprawling empires, the volatile swings of the global marketplace, and the secret, silent decisions of the human heart, is what the listener actually hears. The vast, treacherous chasm between the spoken word and the received message is a silent graveyard littered with brilliant ideas, shattered careers, and ruined ambitions. To successfully navigate this dangerous psychological landscape, one must completely, violently abandon the swelling ego of the speaker and cross over to intimately inhabit the deeply guarded, emotional, and often entirely irrational mind of the audience. The true architecture of persuasion is not built upon the solid foundation of what is factually said, but upon the unpredictable, shifting tectonic plates of human perception, memory, and desire. The profound journey into this linguistic mastery begins in the opulent, marble-lined halls of political power, where a catastrophic misunderstanding of human nature once threatened to tear a society apart. A government, acting with a cold, detached calculus of economic redistribution, sought to implement a heavy financial levy on the inherited wealth of its most affluent citizens. To the highly educated policymakers, the economists, and the lawmakers safely insulated in their ivory towers, the terminology was simple, accurate, and completely benign: the estate tax. In their sterile, logical minds, an estate was a sprawling, aristocratic manifestation of excessive wealth, vast tracts of land, sprawling mansions, and overflowing bank accounts. Taxing such excess seemed not only economically sound but morally just. They launched their campaigns, proudly defending the estate tax with complex charts, long-winded academic speeches, and dense, impenetrable economic theories. But outside those marble walls, in the sprawling heartlands, the dusty farming communities, and the quiet, struggling suburban streets, the message collided with a vastly different, heavily fortified psychological reality. The common people did not hear a policy about aristocratic wealth, they heard a shadowy, menacing threat from a greedy, overreaching authority. Yet, the opposition to this tax remained fractured and weak, unable to articulate the deep, visceral unease bubbling in the collective subconscious. It was in this moment of political stagnation that a masterful architect of language stepped into the fray. This architect did not look at the economic data, he looked deeply into the terrified, protective eyes of the working class. He understood that to defeat the policy, he had to entirely change the emotional frame through which the policy was viewed. He descended into the quiet laboratories of focus groups, listening not to the words the citizens used, but to the hidden, agonizing fears trembling beneath their voices. He realized that the concept of an estate meant absolutely nothing to them. But death was universal. Death was the ultimate, tragic vulnerability. With a stroke of terrifying linguistic genius, the architect stripped away the sterile, academic label and rechristened the policy with a name that would echo like a gunshot across the nation: the death tax. The transformation that followed was nothing short of a violent, psychological revolution. The moment those two simple, devastating words were unleashed into the public consciousness, a massive, uncontrollable shockwave of profound moral outrage detonated across the country. It no longer mattered that the vast, overwhelming majority of the enraged citizens would never possess enough wealth to actually be subjected to the tax. The logical reality of the policy was instantly, entirely incinerated by the blistering heat of the new emotional frame. When the masses heard death tax, they did not envision a billionaire parting with a fraction of a massive fortune. They visualized the cold, skeletal hand of the government reaching directly into the grave to rob a grieving, devastated family of their final, sacred inheritance. They felt a deep, primal violation of the natural order. The narrative had been violently hijacked. The politicians who stubbornly continued to defend the estate tax found themselves screaming into a hurricane, their complex economic arguments completely drowned out by the deafening, emotional roar of a populace that felt fundamentally, morally attacked. The policy, once viewed as a safe, sensible economic measure, became a toxic, radioactive liability, eventually suffering a crushing, humiliating defeat. Analyzing this monumental shift reveals the terrifying, absolute power of emotional framing over intellectual reasoning. The lesson extracted from the ashes of this political battlefield is that human beings do not process information like cold, calculating machines. They process words through a deeply personal, highly sensitive filter constructed entirely of their own fears, aspirations, and lived experiences. The master of language intimately understands that a word is never just a neutral container for a definition, it is a highly volatile emotional trigger. By perfectly swapping the word estate, a word completely devoid of emotional resonance for the average person, with the word death, a word that carries the heaviest, most agonizing psychological weight in the human experience, the architect completely rewired the neurological response of an entire nation. The failure of the original politicians was their arrogant, fatal assumption that their own highly specialized, academic vocabulary would seamlessly transfer its meaning into the minds of the public. They fail to realize that if a message does not instantly, powerfully align with the pre-existing emotional landscape of the listener, the message is not merely misunderstood, it is actively, aggressively rejected as a hostile threat. The ultimate truth is that the speaker's intention is entirely irrelevant. If the listener's brain interprets a word as an attack on their fundamental values, all the logical evidence in the universe will not save the speaker from absolute ruin. The narrative gracefully shifts from the chaotic, blood-stained arenas of political warfare to the glittering, neon-drenched deserts of the entertainment industry, where another massive, high-stakes battle for the human mind was quietly unfolding. In the sprawling, opulent casinos that rose like mirages from the barren earth, a highly lucrative industry found itself suddenly slamming into a massive, impenetrable wall of moral resistance. For decades, the industry had proudly and openly referred to its core offering by its traditional, accurate name, gambling. But as the culture shifted, the word began to carry a heavy, suffocating, and deeply toxic stigma. When the average, hard-working citizen heard the word gambling, their mind was instantly flooded with dark, terrifying, and highly destructive imagery. They envisioned desperate, broken individuals losing their life savings in dimly lit, smoke-filled rooms. They saw shattered families, crippling addiction, and the shadowy, menacing presence of organized crime. The word gambling evoked a deep sense of moral decay and financial ruin. Consequently, massive segments of the population violently rejected the industry, refusing to step foot inside the glittering palaces, and lawmakers began to sharpen their knives, preparing to heavily regulate and suffocate the businesses. The industry executives, panicking as their revenues threatened to plummet, tried desperately to argue that their establishments were safe, secure, and heavily regulated, but their logical defenses were useless against the deep, visceral disgust triggered by the word itself. Once again, the silent, invisible power of linguistic alchemy was called upon to rescue an empire on the brink of collapse. The masters of communication realized that they could not possibly change the dark, deeply ingrained cultural associations attached to the word gambling. The word was permanently stained. Therefore, the word had to be entirely, ruthlessly eradicated from the corporate vocabulary. The architects of language searched for a new vessel, a word that described the exact same physical activity but triggered a completely different, overwhelmingly positive neurological response. They found their salvation in a simple, innocent, and highly nostalgic term: gaming. The execution was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely brilliant. The neon signs were altered, the marketing campaigns were completely rewritten, and the internal corporate culture was forcefully retrained. The industry was no longer in the business of gambling, it was the premier destination for gaming. The psychological effect on the global consumer base was instantaneous and staggering. When people heard the word gaming, the dark, terrifying visions of addiction and ruin completely vanished, instantly replaced by light, joyful, and highly comforting imagery. Gaming evoked the innocent, carefree memories of childhood board games, the thrilling, harmless excitement of a sporting event, and the warm, connective joy of family recreation. It sounded safe, controlled, and fundamentally entertaining. The exact same physical action, placing a financial wager on a random outcome, was miraculously transubstantiated from a dark, sinful vice into a bright, acceptable form of mainstream entertainment. The moral resistance completely melted away. Middle-class families who would have never, ever taken a vacation to a gambling town suddenly flocked by the millions to the sprawling gaming resorts, eager to partake in the harmless, thrilling diversion. The massive, impenetrable wall of cultural stigma was effortlessly bypassed, not by fundamentally altering the product, but by completely repainting the psychological door through which the consumer entered. The profound analysis of this corporate resurrection exposes the incredible, almost magical power of linguistic categorization. The lesson here is that words act as the ultimate sorting mechanism for the human brain. When a word is spoken, the brain instantly, automatically categorizes the concept, placing it into a specific mental file folder that is permanently attached to a specific set of highly potent emotions. The word gambling was permanently filed under danger and vice. The word gaming was firmly filed under safety and play. The master communicator understands that if your product, your idea, or your personal identity is trapped in a negative mental category, you cannot forcefully argue your way out of it. You must elegantly, strategically change the label to trick the brain into moving the concept into an entirely new, positive category. This is not mere deception, it is a profound understanding of how human beings construct their reality. We do not react to the objective world, we react entirely to the linguistic map we use to describe that world. By changing the map, the industry completely changed the emotional destination of millions of people, proving that the right word can literally rewrite the moral code of an entire society. As the journey deeper into the mechanics of human persuasion continues, the narrative encounters the fundamental, often tragically ignored principle of absolute simplicity. The scene is a highly anticipated, globally televised press conference. A towering corporate giant, a brilliant CEO whose mind operates on the absolute bleeding edge of technological innovation, steps up to the microphones to explain a massive, highly controversial shift in his company's strategy. This man possesses a genius-level intellect, and he is deeply, aggressively proud of his vast, expansive vocabulary. He begins to speak, unleashing a dense, suffocating blizzard of complex, highly technical jargon. He speaks of synergistic paradigm shifts, asymmetrical optimization, and cross-platform architectural realignments. He believes that by using big, complicated, and highly academic words, he is projecting an aura of supreme, unassailable intelligence and commanding absolute, unquestioning authority. He expects the massive audience of journalists and the millions watching at home to be deeply awed by his towering intellectual capacity. But as the minutes agonizingly tick by, the atmosphere in the sprawling room turns incredibly cold, dark, and deeply hostile. The journalist's eyes glaze over with a mixture of profound boredom and rising, aggressive suspicion. The public watching from their living rooms instantly changes the channel or mutters curses at the screen. The brilliant CEO, armed with a vocabulary that could rival a prestigious academic journal, is completely, utterly failing. He is not projecting authority, he is projecting a deep, terrifying arrogance and a highly suspicious lack of transparency. The catastrophic unraveling of this brilliant, highly educated executive serves as the ultimate, undeniable testament to the absolute supremacy of simplicity in the brutal arena of human communication. He committed the ultimate, fatal sin of the intellectual elite. He confused clarity with condescension. The towering, complex architecture of his vocabulary did not build a bridge to his audience, it constructed a massive, impenetrable, and deeply intimidating wall. When the average, overworked, and highly stressed individual hears a dense, suffocating string of corporate jargon, their brain does not eagerly reach for a dictionary. Instead, their fragile, highly defensive ego feels immediately, aggressively attacked. They feel intentionally excluded, intellectually diminished, and profoundly disrespected. And in the dark, highly reactive depths of human psychology, when an individual is made to feel foolish or inferior, they do not respond with quiet awe, they respond with a fierce, burning, and highly vindictive anger. They immediately, unconsciously assume that the speaker is hiding a dark, sinister truth behind the thick, impenetrable fog of massive words. The profound analysis of this highly public, deeply humiliating corporate suicide reveals the single, most heavily guarded secret of the world's most terrifyingly effective communicators. True, absolute genius is never, ever demonstrated by the ability to take a simple concept and make it agonizingly complex. It is demonstrated exclusively by the miraculous, incredibly rare ability to take a massive, terrifyingly complex reality and distill it down into a pure, crystalline, and effortlessly digestible drop of absolute simplicity. The master communicator intimately, deeply understands that the human ear is a remarkably lazy, highly selective organ. It actively, ruthlessly filters out anything that requires excessive, painful cognitive effort. Therefore, the absolute, unyielding rule of the linguistic master is to ruthlessly, aggressively purge their vocabulary of any word that could possibly be misunderstood or resented. They speak not to demonstrate their own towering brilliance, but to perfectly, flawlessly illuminate the mind of the listener. They understand the golden, immutable law that it is absolutely, entirely irrelevant what you actually say. The only physical reality that exists in the entire universe of persuasion is what the audience ultimately, emotionally hears. This profound, unyielding dedication to simplicity seamlessly, inevitably merges into the terrifying, highly aggressive, and deeply vital principle of absolute brevity. The narrative plunges directly into the incredibly chaotic, deafening, and highly distracted modern world, a sprawling, chaotic landscape where human attention is a fragile, flickering candle trapped in a massive, roaring hurricane of endless, screaming information. The amateur communicator, desperate, highly anxious, and deeply insecure, believes that persuasion is a matter of overwhelming sheer volume. They mistakenly, tragically assume that if they can just keep talking, if they can just pile massive, towering mountains of evidence, lengthy, exhausting anecdotes, and endless, highly detailed explanations upon the crushing weight of their argument, the audience will eventually, inevitably surrender to the sheer, exhausting magnitude of their words. But the exact, terrifying opposite is the absolute truth. The human brain is a highly defensive, incredibly stingy fortress. It violently, aggressively repels long, suffocating sieges of endless words. The master of language, operating with the cold, detached precision of a highly trained sniper, understands that words are like a finite, incredibly precious currency, and every single, unnecessary syllable violently devalues the entire, overarching message. They construct their sentences to be incredibly short, highly explosive, and deeply penetrating. They strip away the weak, modifying adjectives, the passive, meandering verbs, and the useless, highly distracting filler. When they deliver the message, it does not slowly, agonizingly wash over the audience like a slow, exhausting, and highly tedious tide. It strikes the collective consciousness with the sudden, breathtaking, and entirely unavoidable force of a lightning bolt. The profound lesson extracted from this ruthless, highly disciplined economy of language is that brevity projects absolute, unshakable, and highly intimidating confidence. When an individual can state their entire, massive, and highly complex vision in a single, perfectly crafted, and beautifully concise sentence, they silently, overwhelmingly communicate that they are in total, absolute command of the facts, completely devoid of any desperate, fearful need to over-explain or defensively justify their position. The audience is instantly, powerfully magnetized by this crisp, authoritative brevity, eagerly, hungrily consuming the small, perfectly portioned morsel of truth because it requires absolutely zero, painful cognitive digestion, as the master communicator hones their incredibly sharp, highly disciplined words. They must also master the deeply psychological, entirely invisible art of visual engineering. The epic, sweeping narrative shifts to the highly controversial, intensely hostile, and deeply lucrative battleground of the global energy industry. A massive, incredibly wealthy corporation is desperately seeking public approval to access deep, hidden, and highly profitable reserves of natural resources entirely buried beneath a pristine, highly cherished, and deeply protected natural landscape. The corporate executives, operating purely on cold, hard, and deeply mechanical logic, draft a massive, highly funded public relations campaign completely centered around the highly accurate, technically precise term, oil drilling. The moment this phrase is broadcasted to the public, a massive, highly explosive, and entirely uncontrollable firestorm of deep, burning public outrage instantly erupts. The words oil drilling do not simply convey a mechanical, industrial process to the human brain, they forcefully, violently project a highly vivid, incredibly dark, and deeply terrifying motion picture directly onto the sensitive, highly emotional screen of the public imagination. The audience instantly, involuntarily visualizes massive, ugly, rust-covered machinery violently, aggressively tearing into the sacred, beautiful earth. They see thick, toxic, and incredibly deadly black sludge suffocating innocent, fragile wildlife. They visualize greedy, shadowy corporate villains coldly, ruthlessly destroying the delicate, irreplaceable balance of nature for a few dirty dollars. The logical, highly scientific arguments regarding the desperate, national need for energy independence are completely, utterly incinerated by the blistering heat of these terrifying, highly emotional, and completely unavoidable mental images. The corporation is violently, aggressively pushed to the absolute brink of total, humiliating defeat. In this moment of absolute, terrifying corporate crisis, the linguistic architects are called upon to perform a miraculous, highly calculated, and deeply manipulative psychological rescue. They realize, with chilling, perfect clarity, that you cannot fight a highly emotional, deeply terrifying mental image with cold, invisible, and completely abstract statistics. You must violently, completely overwrite the terrifying image with a new, highly inspiring, and deeply comforting visual narrative. The term oil drilling is immediately, ruthlessly executed, completely banished from all corporate communication. In its place, the architects deploy a phrase of absolute, breathtaking psychological brilliance: energy exploration. The transformation in the public consciousness is instantaneous, profound, and utterly staggering. The phrase energy exploration does not evoke violent, toxic, and highly destructive imagery. Instead, it instantly, powerfully summons bright, highly inspiring, and deeply heroic visions into the minds of the audience. They visualize brave, highly educated scientists and bold, visionary pioneers venturing into the great, unknown frontier, utilizing clean, highly advanced, and deeply sophisticated technology to safely, responsibly secure a bright, glowing future of civilization. The word energy evokes warmth, life, progress, and absolute necessity, completely stripping away the dirty, toxic, and highly visceral connotations of the word oil. The word exploration evokes a deep, ancient, and highly romantic human aspiration, completely replacing the violent, aggressive, and highly destructive violence inherent in the word drilling. The exact same physical, highly industrial action is still being proposed, but the emotional, highly visual framing has been completely, entirely revolutionized. The massive, impenetrable wall of public hostility miraculously, beautifully crumbles, replaced by a cautious, highly receptive, and deeply cooperative curiosity, proving definitively that words are not merely sounds vibrating in the air, they are incredibly powerful, highly vivid paintbrushes that violently, aggressively, and completely paint the emotional reality of the listener. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of this visual framing is further, incredibly deeply explored in the highest, most consequential, and intensely contested political battlefields regarding the very future, the absolute survival, of the entire planet. The sprawling narrative examines the massive, highly polarizing, and deeply emotional global debate surrounding the shifting temperatures of the Earth. For years, the passionate, highly educated, and deeply concerned environmental advocates utilize the highly aggressive, deeply alarming, and intensely terrifying phrase, global warming. This phrase was highly effective at generating massive, sudden bursts of absolute, sheer panic among the populace. It painted a highly vivid, apocalyptic, and deeply terrifying picture of a boiling, desolate, and utterly doomed planet, demanding immediate, massive, and highly economically disruptive action to avert total, unavoidable catastrophe. However, this high state of perpetual, burning panic is incredibly exhausting for the human nervous system to maintain. Over time, the massive, highly resistant, and deeply economically motivated opposition forces recognized a fatal, highly exploitable psychological flaw in the phrase. They consulted the master linguists, seeking a way to completely diffuse the burning, urgent panic without actually denying the underlying, measurable scientific reality. The solution was an incredibly subtle, highly calculated, and deeply neutralizing shift in terminology. They aggressively, relentlessly began to reframe the entire, massive conversation around the phrase, climate change. The psychological impact of this linguistic pivot was incredibly profound, deeply subtle, and highly effective. The phrase climate change completely, utterly lacks the violent, catastrophic, and highly terrifying urgency of global warming. The word climate sounds vast, ancient, incredibly slow, and deeply scientific. The word change is neutral, inevitable, and completely natural. Seasons change, tides change, the world changes. By carefully, highly strategically adopting this new, heavily neutralized phrase, the opposition successfully, completely drained the blinding, terrifying urgency out of the massive environmental movement. They brilliantly, highly deceptively reframed a terrifying, man-made, and highly immediate catastrophe into a slow, natural, and highly debatable phenomenon that required lengthy, deeply cautious, and highly measured academic study rather than sudden, massive, and highly expensive political action. The deep, analytical lesson extracted from this monumental, highly consequential clash of words is that the master communicator does not just use languages to describe a problem, they aggressively, brilliantly use languages to precisely, exactly dictate the perceived velocity, the exact severity, and the absolute emotional weight of the problem. They completely, totally understand that whoever defines the specific, highly visual terms of the debate ultimately, entirely, and absolutely controls the final, inevitable political outcome. Yet, all the brilliant simplicity, the crushing, highly explosive brevity, and the perfectly engineered, deeply emotional visual framing in the world will ultimately, tragically dissolve into complete, empty nothingness if they are not bound together by the absolute, most grueling, and deeply exhausting discipline of human communication, relentless, unbreakable, and highly agonizing consistency. The narrative thrusts the audience into the exhausting, highly repetitive, and deeply maddening world of a grueling, incredibly lengthy political campaign. The candidate, a highly charismatic, deeply intelligent, and incredibly ambitious individual, has been provided with a perfectly crafted, highly resonant, and brilliantly visual core message by the master architects of language. For the first few weeks, the candidate delivers the precise, exact message with fiery, massive enthusiasm, and the massive, cheering crowds respond with profound, roaring approval. But as the long, highly exhausting months violently drag on, delivering the exact same, highly specific sequence of words hundreds, even thousands of times, the highly intelligent candidate begins to suffer from a massive, deeply agonizing psychological fatigue. They become incredibly, deeply bored with their own voice. They arrogantly, foolishly assume that because they have heard the message 1,000 times, the vast, highly distracted public must also be entirely, completely sick of it, driven by a massive, highly destructive urge for intellectual stimulation and a deep, burning desire to showcase their vast, expansive knowledge. The candidate begins to spontaneously, recklessly improvise. They change the perfectly crafted words, they alter the highly visual examples, and they completely abandon the central, highly engineered emotional frame. The result is a sudden, catastrophic, and completely devastating collapse in their political momentum. The polling numbers plummet, the massive crowds become confused and deeply indifferent, and the entire, highly expensive campaign rapidly violently spirals toward absolute, humiliating ruin. The desperate, highly panicked candidate turns to the master linguist, demanding to know why the brilliant, highly educated, and newly improvised speeches are completely, utterly failing. The master delivers a cold, harsh, and deeply unforgiving psychological truth that shatters the candidate's massive, fragile ego. The analysis dictates that the human consciousness is a thick, highly impenetrable, and incredibly noisy fortress. The vast, overwhelming majority of the public is barely paying attention. They are consumed by their own massive, highly stressful lives. A brilliant, perfectly crafted message does not instantly, miraculously penetrate this thick, heavy armor the first time it is spoken. It bounces off harmlessly. It must be repeated, violently, aggressively, and exactly, over, and over, and over again. The master explains that the exact, terrifying moment the speaker becomes completely, physically, and emotionally sick and profoundly tired of repeating the exact same message is the precise, miraculous, and highly delayed moment that the distracted, overwhelmed audience is finally, barely beginning to actually hear and permanently remember it. The ultimate, absolute lesson is that communication is not a single, beautiful, and highly fleeting event. It is a brutal, highly disciplined, and completely relentless war of attrition. The master communicator completely, selflessly subordinates their own massive, ego-driven desire for personal entertainment and intellectual variety to the cold, hard, and deeply mechanical necessity of absolute, unyielding repetition, proving definitively that consistency is the heavy, relentless hammer that ultimately, violently drives the linguistic nail deeply and permanently into the solid, heavy wood of the public mind. The transition from the agonizing crucible of relentless consistency leads the now hardened, deeply disciplined communicator directly into a new, infinitely more complex, and deeply spiritual psychological frontier. The politician, having finally, brutally mastered the exhausting art of unbroken repetition, successfully watches as the previously indifferent, highly distracted masses finally begin to accurately echo the perfectly crafted, highly simplified message back to them. The intellectual battle has been undeniably, absolutely won. The public memory has been successfully, permanently penetrated. Yet, a strange, terrifying, and deeply frustrating paralysis completely grips the sprawling populace. They remember the words perfectly. They understand the stark, simple visual framing completely. But they absolutely, stubbornly refuse to physically move, to passionately vote, or to fiercely advocate for the cause. The massive, cheering crowds are replaced by a cold, deeply analytical, and highly passive acceptance. The desperate, highly ambitious leader turns once again to the master linguistic architect, completely bewildered by this new, silent wall of total behavioral stagnation. The master, looking deeply into the frustrated eyes of the leader, unveils the next, profoundly beautiful, and incredibly powerful secret of absolute human persuasion, the desperate, eternal human hunger for profound aspiration. The analysis dictates that human beings are fundamentally, deeply aspirational creatures, perpetually, agonizingly trapped in the mundane, highly stressful reality of their daily survival, yet constantly, desperately looking upward toward the bright, glowing heavens of their own massive, unfulfilled potential. When a speaker delivers a message that is merely factual, highly logical, and relentlessly consistent, they are only communicating with the cold, mechanical processing centers of the brain. They are offering a highly efficient, perfectly constructed vehicle, but they have completely, utterly failed to provide any high-octane, deeply emotional fuel, to command not just the memory, but the fierce, burning, and completely unstoppable physical action of an entire population. The master communicator must completely, brilliantly transcend the gritty, depressing reality of what currently is, and boldly, beautifully speak to the soaring, magnificent, and highly idealized vision of what could magically, inevitably be. The epic, sweeping narrative thrusts the audience directly into a highly pivotal, deeply consequential moment in human history, where a massive, incredibly powerful social movement is desperately attempting to completely overthrow a deeply entrenched, highly oppressive, and massively funded systemic injustice. The highly educated, deeply passionate leaders of the movement approach the massive, exhausted, and highly fearful public with perfectly researched, highly detailed, and relentlessly consistent 10-point plans for incremental, highly logical legislative reform. They speak endlessly, consistently of complex policy adjustments, necessary regulatory frameworks, and vital, highly statistical economic redistributions. The public, utterly crushed by the heavy, suffocating weight of their own daily, agonizing struggles, listens with complete, utter exhaustion. The incredibly logical, perfectly consistent message sounds like nothing more than a massive, unbearable mountain of terrifying, highly complicated new work. The movement begins to rapidly, violently stall, suffocating under the massive, crushing weight of its own cold, uninspiring, and highly academic intellect. It is in this exact, terrifying moment of absolute, impending failure that a singular, profoundly gifted master of language steps onto the massive, sun-drenched steps of history. This individual completely, ruthlessly discards the massive, highly detailed binders of complex policy proposals. They stand before a massive, sprawling ocean of desperate, highly anxious humanity, and they do not speak a single, solitary word about policy, regulations, or complex economic theory. Instead, they unleash a soaring, incredibly beautiful, and profoundly poetic vision of a future so bright, so deeply equitable, and so profoundly magnificent that it completely, instantly shatters the heavy, suffocating chains of the audience's present despair. They use language that aggressively, beautifully reaches past the tired, cynical, and highly defensive intellect, speaking directly, profoundly to the deep, burning, and highly aspirational soul of every single listener. They paint a vivid, highly emotional, and deeply irresistible picture of a society completely bypassing the deep, terrifying, and highly divisive realities of the present conflict. The staggering, completely overwhelming result of this highly aspirational, deeply visionary communication is the instantaneous, massive, and completely unstoppable mobilization of an entire generation. The deeply analytical lesson extracted from this monumental, highly historic triumph is that people do not ever, under any circumstances, willingly march into terrifying, highly dangerous battle for a complex, highly logical spreadsheet or a perfectly crafted, highly consistent policy document. They march, they fiercely fight, and they willingly, joyfully sacrifice their very lives exclusively for a beautiful, highly aspirational, and deeply resonant dream. The absolute master of language knows that to truly, completely move the heavy, immovable mountains of human behavior, you must perfectly, flawlessly articulate the highest, most noble, and incredibly desperate hopes completely hidden within the deep, silent, and highly guarded sanctuary of the listener's heart. Yet, this magnificent, soaring, and deeply aspirational communication strategy inevitably encounters the absolute, most terrifying, deeply selfish, and profoundly impenetrable barrier in the entire, vast psychological landscape of human persuasion, the dark, cynical, and highly protective fortress of absolute self-interest. The narrative shifts violently from the soaring, bright heights of historical social movements to the cold, ruthless, and incredibly calculated world of massive, high-stakes commercial marketing. A towering, incredibly wealthy global corporation has spent billions of dollars perfectly engineering a massive, highly technological product designed to completely, fundamentally revolutionize the very fabric of daily human existence. They deploy the absolute greatest, highly expensive linguistic architects to craft a message of stunning simplicity, crushing brevity, perfect, relentless consistency, and soaring, highly aspirational vision. They broadcast this perfect, magnificent linguistic masterpiece to the entire, sprawling globe, fully expecting the massive, eager masses to instantly, completely surrender their wealth in exchange for the revolutionary miracle. But the massive, incredibly expensive campaign is met with a cold, deafening, and highly terrifying silence. The towering executives, completely panicked and deeply confused, demand to passionately know why their perfect, flawless, and highly aspirational message has completely, entirely failed. The master linguist delivers the incredibly harsh, deeply humbling, and entirely inescapable truth that absolutely shatters the corporation's massive, highly inflated ego. The master coldly explains that the entire, incredibly expensive message was fundamentally, fatally flawed because it was entirely, exclusively focused on the massive, towering greatness of the corporation and the incredible, highly complex brilliance of the product itself. The message had completely, utterly failed to explicitly, directly, and aggressively answer the single, most important, deeply selfish, and eternally burning question that absolutely dominates the forefront of every single human consciousness on the entire planet. Why does this matter to me? The profound, highly analytical lesson is that the human ego is an incredibly vast, entirely self-centered, and deeply paranoid universe. Every single piece of incoming information is instantly, violently interrogated by a highly sensitive, deeply selfish neurological security system that aggressively demands to know exactly, specifically how the information will directly, materially, and immediately benefit the individual listener. If a message, no matter how perfectly simple, relentlessly consistent, or beautifully aspirational, fails to instantly, clearly, and highly personally demonstrate massive, undeniable relevance to the listener's own highly specific, deeply stressful daily life, the message is instantly, ruthlessly discarded as completely, entirely meaningless noise. The master communicator intimately, profoundly understands that absolute, undeniable relevance is the only true, completely effective key that unlocks the massive, heavy vault of human attention. They meticulously, carefully construct every single, perfectly chosen word not to boast about the immense, towering features of the offering, but to deeply, emotionally, and highly aggressively illustrate exactly how the offering will miraculously, instantly, and completely solve the deep, agonizing, and highly specific pain points currently tormenting the exact, specific individual standing directly in front of them. As the sprawling, deeply psychological, and incredibly intense journey reaches its absolute, magnificent, and highly philosophical zenith, the ultimate, terrifying, and completely inescapable paradox of all human communication is finally, dramatically revealed in its raw, blinding, and absolute entirety. The protagonist, having completely, flawlessly mastered the absolute discipline of stunning simplicity, crushing brevity, highly evocative visual framing, relentless consistency, soaring aspiration, and deeply piercing, highly personal relevance, steps onto the ultimate, final stage of absolute, global influence. They are fully prepared to deliver the absolute, most perfect, highly engineered, and deeply psychological message ever entirely conceived by the human mind. They possess the exact, magical linguistic keys to completely, effortlessly unlock any human heart and absolutely, entirely command any human action. Yet, in this ultimate, supreme moment of unparalleled, massive power, the master completely, entirely realizes that all of these brilliant, highly sophisticated, and perfectly executed techniques are completely, entirely worthless, utterly devoid of any true, lasting, and deeply resonant power, if they are not firmly, absolutely anchored to the heavy, immovable, and deeply sacred bedrock of absolute, undeniable, and completely transparent personal credibility. The profound, sweeping analysis of this ultimate, final revelation dictates that the human subconscious possesses an incredibly ancient, highly sensitive, and completely infallible radar specifically, highly aggressively designed to instantly, violently detect hypocrisy, deceit, and highly manipulative, deeply selfish intent. You can perfectly, flawlessly execute every single, highly guarded rule of the absolute greatest communicators in history, but if the massive, watchful audience fundamentally, deeply senses that your internal, hidden character is entirely misaligned with your beautiful, soaring words, the entire, massive, highly engineered linguistic cathedral will violently, completely, and permanently collapse into a massive, smoking ruin of absolute, humiliating distrust. The ultimate, absolute master deeply, profoundly understands that you do not merely speak a message, you physically, entirely, and completely embody the message. Your incredibly powerful, perfectly chosen words are only as strong, only as deeply resonant, and only as immensely persuasive as the absolute, transparent, and completely undeniable integrity of the human being who dares to utter them into the cold, unforgiving universe. The core message and profound, deeply transformative meaning that this monumental, incredibly influential book intends to definitively, absolutely convey to its vast, global audience of eager, highly ambitious readers is the complete, absolute, and total annihilation of the speaker's massive, demanding, and highly selfish ego. It teaches, with absolute, terrifying, and perfectly crystal clear clarity, that the entire, vast universe of successful human communication does not revolve, even slightly, around the immense, towering brilliance of your own personal intellect, the staggering, complex depth of your own vast vocabulary, or the deep, burning, and highly passionate intensity of your own personal convictions. The book violently, aggressively, and completely shatters the deeply ingrained, highly arrogant illusion that communication is an act of forcefully projecting your own internal reality onto the external world, replacing it with the profound, humbling, and absolute truth that true, massive persuasion is an act of deep, total, and completely selfless surrender to the highly volatile, deeply emotional, and completely subjective reality of the audience. It demands that the reader completely, entirely abandon the incredibly foolish, highly destructive obsession with carefully, perfectly crafting exactly what they desperately want to say, and instead dedicate their entire, absolute, and deeply empathetic existence to meticulously, perfectly engineering exactly, precisely what the incredibly fragile, highly defensive, and deeply self-interested human mind is actually, fundamentally capable of hearing. The ultimate, absolute, and undeniable truth of the entire human experience is that you are never, ever judged by the brilliant words that leave your lips, but exclusively, permanently by the emotional echoes that perfectly, silently remain in the listener's heart.